Okay, welcome back to the final episode of required reading for our read of Gremlins, the novelization. So today we're going to read chapters 19 and 20 because honestly 19 is pretty significant and 20 is kind of teeny tiny. So here we go. This is the final two chapters of the novelization of Gremlins, written by George Gipe. Well, they're not going to keep me away from my own house, Rand Peltzer shouted over his shoulder as he trotted out of the all-night gas station toward his car. The attendant didn't deserve being yelled at, Rand thought, especially since he was offering friendly advice. But it had been a harrowing night and Rand's nerves were just about shot. The tension had begun during the sales meeting when he became concerned about getting home on the snow-covered roads. Concern turned to worry when he was unable to get a call through to Lynn, and worry turned to near panic when he began hearing the reports of strange happenings in and around Kingston Falls. Shortly after midnight, Wren decided he could not stick to his original, no doubt sensible plan of spending the night at a motel so that crews would have time to clear the roads. He had to find out if his loved ones were all right. A few minutes later, as the last salespeople were scattering to their rooms or the nearest cocktail lounge, Wren had gotten in his car and headed home. After the stop for gas, where he received a running account of the troubles in Kingston Falls along with the recapitulation of the official warning that visitors should stay out of the town if possible, Wren stopped by Lynn's mother's house. She wasn't overjoyed at being awakened at such an ungodly hour, but understood that Barney had to be picked up and taken home. Realizing his mother-in-law had gone to bed very early and was unaware of the troubles in Kingston Falls, Rand decided not to cause her unnecessary worry. Apologizing for his late arrival, he took the dog and said nothing more. Putting Barney in the front seat beside him, Rand set out again for Kingston Falls, hoping he would be able to get there by 2 a.m. The journey seemed interminable. Rand had never enjoyed driving in the snow. In fact, he hated it and avoided doing so whenever possible, even if the skies were clear. Fighting bad driving conditions alone and at night was unthinkable except in the case of an emergency such as this one. Nevertheless, 20 miles down the highway, he began to wonder if he had done the right thing. One detour after another sprang up, so deflecting him from his destination that several times he had to consult the road map to see where he was. Twice he made wrong turns because of poor visibility, once more because a road sign was turned the wrong way, and another time because a military policeman ordered him onto a side road he had no intention of taking. Throughout the increasingly desperate journey, his car radio issued a string of bulletins that were hardly designed to assure him everything was all right at home. Futterman dead. Mrs. Deagle dead. Stores and offices he had visited only days before nearly torn to pieces by unknown forces. Rumors of tiny but fierce aliens ransacking the town and attacking people. Most forms of communication out, or intermittent at best. The majority of the town's population either hiding or on the road, fleeing like refugees during wartime. Marines on the way. Continued urgings not to be alarmed seemed only to increase his insecurity rather than assuage it. It seemed so hideously incredible. Little did he realize that he, solid citizen Rand Peltzer, was the man who was really responsible for the chaotic chain of events. Shortly after 4 o'clock, his nerves jangling from the constant frustration of detours through the snow and uncertainty of not knowing how Lynn and Billy were, he pulled off Highway 46 onto Main Street, approaching Kingston Falls from the south rather than the east, his normal route. Just ahead, he could see an orange glow and considerable smoke, a situation made even scarier by the absence of fire engines, sirens, curious spectators, or traffic control guards. It was, as far as he could see, a major fire that was burning itself out while the town's population, official and otherwise, simply ignored it. Or, he thought, perhaps there was no population. No, he prayed. Let them be all right, please. He wanted to append the promise of some change in himself as payment if his prayer were answered, but for the life of him, Rand couldn't think of a thing God might want from him. I'll be better, he said finally. I'll go to church every week. The fire, he noted as he approached to within a block of it, was coming from the Colony Theater. The entire building appeared gutted. Braking so that he could get a longer view of the burned-out structure, Rand shook his head. I just don't get it, he murmured. Where is everybody? No firemen, no fire freaks, not even a looter. It's crazy. It's unreal. As he spoke, a quick and sudden movement to his right caught his eye. Crossing the street directly in his path and only a few feet from the car was a what? Hitting the brakes hard to bring the car to a complete stop, Rand wasn't sure just what it was that he had so narrowly avoided. It was small enough to be a dog, but walked upright, and the face he had glimpsed was unlike anything he had ever seen before outside of a horror movie or at Halloween. Was this one of the tiny creatures they had described on the radio? It was gone almost before he could get a second glance, darting in front of the car at a low angle and trundling across the sidewalk to the Montgomery Ward store. In the dim early morning light, Rand saw only a greenish-brown black bristling with a sort of horny plating, the sort of side view presented by some large fish or reptile. With a quick glance over its shoulder, the creature disappeared into the department store by the open side entrance door. What's going on here? Rand demanded. What was that thing? And what's Montgomery Ward doing open at this hour? Barney, having been jolted awake by the sudden braking of the car, broke into loud querulous barking when he caught sight of the gremlin. Desperately trying to get even a few inches closer to it, he broad-jumped into the back seat and began clawing at the left rear window. Take it easy, boy, Rand said firmly. Whatever it is, it's not our job to track it down. His head still turned to the left in order to spot the strange creature should it come out of the store, Rand heard the running footsteps before he saw the two approaching people. When he recognized who they were, his mouth fell open, his expression a mixture of complete surprise and happiness. Billy! He said. Bursting from the car, he embraced his son, all the while bombarding him with questions. What's been going on here anyway? Is your mother all right? Why are you running? Sorry, Dad, Billy replied, pulling away. We've got to catch that. Did you see a gremlin go by? A what? Billy explained as quickly as possible what they were chasing, not going into why. Rand pointed towards the department store door. Nodding, Billy grabbed Kate's hand and started to run off, but Rand managed to get a hold of his other arm and spin him around. Wait a second, he shouted. Don't run off. I want to know how your mother is. Okay, I think, Billy replied, backing toward the door as he spoke. The phone's out, but she's locked in the house. Sorry, Dad, but I've got to catch that gremlin. Why? It looks dangerous. It is. Then let the cops do it. No time. Wait, I'll help. The offer was delivered to empty air, Billy and Kate having already disappeared into the department store. Momentarily confused and indecisive, Rand stood on the sidewalk scratching his head. He still wasn't sure what was going on, but he knew he hadn't driven all night just to be a spectator. If Billy had a problem, it was his problem too. And maybe even Barney's, Rand thought, moving quickly back to the car. Come on, boy, he said to the impatient Barney, pushing the front seat forward so the dog could jump onto the sidewalk. Let's go help Billy. As he slammed the door and started to turn away, Rand's eyes fell on an object lying in the back seat. His bathroom buddy. It was perfect now, he was sure of it, and several people at the sales meeting had expressed interest in marketing it on a major scale. Knowing that, and remembering that one door of his car still refused to lock, he made a quick decision. "Maybe I just better take this along," he said, reaching into the back for the device. "I'd sure hate to have somebody come along and steal this baby just when she's about to make a lot of money for us." Holding the bathroom buddy in front of him in both hands, rather like a high port arms, he ran with surprising speed into the Montgomery Ward store, followed immediately by Barney, whose flashing eyes and agitated nose indicated he was eager for the hunt. General David Greene was starting to become more than a little angry and frustrated. It was now well after 5 o'clock, and the sky was beginning to lighten considerably. For the better part of 2 hours his men had been going from house to house and building to building in the northern section of Kingston Falls, searching for the little green monsters. Their lack of success so far had been total. "Well, what do you think, Medved?" he muttered to his aide, who was never more than 30 inches away. Major Josh Medved knew better than to respond immediately. When General Greene asked you what you thought, it meant that he was going to tell you what he thought. "Tell you what I think," Greene continued. "I think either this whole town's crazy, or they're in cahoots with the Gremlins." "In cahoots, sir?" Medved asked, frowning. He understood exactly what the general was getting at. Any fool could tell that. But from past experience, Medved knew his superior officer appreciated thick-headedness above all other qualities. "Sure," Greene replied. "Maybe not willingly, but I think these people may be sheltering or hiding the Gremlins. Out of fear, maybe. It was like that in Vietnam, you know. Those natives didn't help the VC because they liked 'em or believed in what they were doing. They were just plain scared." "Yes, sir. That makes sense." A lieutenant approached, looked around to see if the TV crew that had accompanied them was shooting. They were, so he saluted smartly. Greene casually returned the salute and waited. "Two things, sir," the lieutenant said. "We talked to some people in the next block who say they saw gremlins at 3 or 3:30. Then they all started to gravitate south, almost like they had an appointment." "Okay, what's the second thing?" "Sergeant Williamson called and said a whole building's on fire down at Main and Garfield. That's south of here at the other end of town. Could be the Gremlins are involved with that." General Greene nodded, and the lieutenant left. "What do you think, Medved?" Greene asked. Major Medved pursed his lips as if he were involved in serious cogitation. "Tell you what I think," the general said. "I think we ought to stop beating the bushes out here and head for that fire where the action is." "Good idea, sir." "Stripe couldn't have picked a much better spot," Billy said with a sigh. Her eyes flitting from side to side as she tried to adjust them in the darkness, Kate knew exactly what he meant. Montgomery Ward was spacious, with most of the merchandise spread over a 4-acre single-floor area. The aisles seemed endless. Some, as the store's advertisements proclaimed, were a quarter-mile long, and were jammed with displays. The illumination was minimal, coming now from small amber night lights at the intersections of the aisles. "He could hide in here forever," Billy said. Kate looked up at the ceiling. Billy, immediately understanding the movement, looked up too. "Yeah," he said. "I wonder if we can find out how to turn on those overheads." "Why don't we split up?" Kate suggested. "You keep looking for Stripe, and I'll try and find the lights." "Good. I think they may be somewhere near the office. Do you know this store?" "Yeah." "Good. Seems to me there's a room where they have everything. Lights, PA system, burglar alarm switches, the works." "Okay. If it's in there, I'll find it." "Maybe you better take Giz," Billy said, handing her the knapsack. He'll be safer with you, and I'll be able to move around better. Gizmo peeked out of the canvas bag sadly, stretched forth a beseeching paw. Sorry, little guy, Billy said, smiling. I better go on this one alone. Kate and Gizmo headed in the direction of the office. Billy, noting that he was in the sporting goods department, grabbed a baseball bat from a nearby rack, tested it for heft, then began a systematic search of the aisles. Alone in the semi-darkness of the huge store, he was suddenly apprehensive, even more so than when he and Gizmo had tracked Stripe into the YMCA building. That episode seemed a long time ago now, although the actual passage of time was less than 12 hours. During that brief period, he had learned the essential thing about gremlins, that their mischievous pranks could lead to violence and death. Although he tried to drive that depressing thought from his mind, it was definitely with him as he walked from aisle to aisle. How much better it will be, he could not help thinking, if I discover Stripe before he discovers me. And how much more unlikely, another part of his mind replied. Annoyed and distracted by his flip-flopping mental gymnastics, he forced himself to concentrate on positive methods of locating the gremlin adversary rather than just walking along, hoping to stumble upon him. What would I do if our places were reversed? He asked himself. The answer seemed self-evident. I would create a distraction so I could spring a trap. Spring a trap with what? With any of 100 things, for the store abounded with potentially lethal weapons, especially to the person who was nervous about being ambushed. The thought having entered his mind, Billy saw the possibility of sudden terror striking him from any part of the store. Remembering the sports equipment section, he envisioned himself being laid low by another baseball bat similar to the one he now carried, shot at by a rifle, struck with weights, a tennis racket, pool cue, or garroted by a jump rope. Passing the automotive section, he saw presented an equally juicy choice of weapons, including tire wrenches, snow chains, trailer hitches, shock absorbers, or decorative hubcaps. The lawn care center presented grisly death via spading fork or rake, and kitchenware threatened him with mutilation by an attacker armed with matching steak knives or barbecue forks. Even the women's clothing section contained items that a clever or desperate attacker could use to terminate him, namely spiked heels, belts, heavy handbags, or metal coat hangers. You're letting yourself get carried away, he whispered to himself. As he spoke, he heard a whirring noise, to which was soon added a faraway metallic singing voice, and the rat-a-tat-tat of a tiny drum. A moment later, rock music augmented the mix into a swirl of overlapping sounds. Advancing cautiously, Billy peeked around the corner of the aisle into what was obviously the toy department. The floor of the entire department was alive with small mechanical devices, robots, wind-up trucks and cars, animals, dolls, and cartoon characters, each one singing or talking or making its own particular sound designed to enchant kids. Now, with all of them operating simultaneously in the semi-darkness of the deserted store, the effect was eerie rather than charming, but it was difficult not to watch. In short, a genial distraction. The distraction, Billy thought, immediately before thwack! Trap. His mind completed the end of the thought even as a blindingly bright silver object passed in front of his eyes and tore into the wall behind him. Wincing in pain, Billy threw his hand to his cheek and brought down the dark, wet stain he knew was blood. Disoriented, he spun around, sensing rather than hearing the approach of another flying object. Just in time, he managed to hurl himself to the floor, the second object passing inches above his head. Thwack! Rolling behind the protection of a display at the end of the aisle, he lay on his stomach, watching the second silver object slide down the wall and come to the rest on the floor beside the first missile. Both objects were members of the rotary saw blade family, one 6 and the other 8 inches in diameter. And more relatives were on the way. Giggling furiously all the while, Stripe leaped from his hiding place to unleash a deadly barrage of similar blades from a display case, quickly shredding the trash box Billy was partially hidden behind, and very nearly decapitating him with several expertly thrown carom shots. Trapped in a corner, Billy could do little but try to deflect the hail of flying steel with the remains of the cardboard box. When he saw the blades were all used, Stripe continued his attack with a variety of hammers, wrenches, small cans of paint, and just about everything else he could get a grip on with his claws. Billy hurled himself backward to avoid a flying crosscut saw and slammed into a display case, which tipped and crashed over, trapping his legs beneath the shelves. Still clutching the shaggy section of trash box as a pitiful shield, he lay on his stomach in a litter of tools, accessories, and home improvement items. Stripe decided to finish him off while he had the chance. Looking about for a suitable device with which to apply the coup de grace, his eyes lit up as they fell on a wonderfully lethal-looking heavy-duty battery. The thing was so leaden that Stripe could barely lift it, but the edge of the monster cube felt even deadlier than it looked. He could easily imagine crushing his enemy's skull with it, even from the shortest of falls. Quickly wrestling the battery to within a few feet of his fallen foe, Stripe held it at his own chest level, poised for the descent onto the back of Billy's head. Then suddenly, dissatisfied at the short distance the battery would have to fall and gain killing momentum, he decided to raise it as high as possible so it would strike with even greater force. Billy began to thrash free from the pile just as Stripe got the battery above his own head. Fear that his quarry was about to escape, combined with the weight of the dense object and Stripe's lack of gripping ability, caused the battery to slip. The battery bounced off his shoulder and landed squarely on Stripe's left foot. Yeah! With a howl of pain, Stripe looked down at the pulpy mass of discolored flesh and shattered bone that used to be his foot and limped quickly away. For a moment, Billy could see nothing but blackness, the battery having finally come to rest not more than an inch in front of his eyes. Pulling himself free of the wreckage, he leaped to his feet and started down the aisle after Stripe. At an intersection of 4 new aisles, he stopped and looked in all directions, but the gremlin was nowhere in sight. "Darn," he sighed. "Where did he go? I sure could use those lights now. I wonder what's happening." Gizmo shivered as he heard the noise of battle from far across the store. It sounded like someone dueling with ladders or a wall collapsing. The heavy silence that followed, however, was even more ominous, causing him to imagine all sorts of terrible things. If Billy had been victorious in that contest of flying objects, wouldn't he have cheered or shouted to Kate and himself? If the chase was still in progress, or even worse, if Billy lay injured or dying, Gizmo knew he was needed. Kate, while looking for the panel that controlled the lights, had placed the knapsack on a table just outside of the store office. Gizmo knew he would be safe there, but the desire to help Billy was vastly more powerful than his sense of self-preservation. Flipping the knapsack cover down, he crawled out of the canvas bag and lowered himself to the floor. Not sure where to go, he padded along aimlessly for a short time, painfully aware of his lack of speed. Another facility creator Mogturman had overlooked while putting together his species. "There has to be a better way," Gizmo murmured. "It'll take me years to get to the other end of the store on these legs." He found what he was looking for a few minutes later, in a tangle of wreckage on the periphery of the toy department. Its wheels were still spinning uselessly, the vehicle having become trapped in a corner. Gizmo approached it cautiously, located the on-off switch, and flipped it, causing the motor to die. Pushing it free of the fallen boxes at the end of the aisle, he rolled it to the middle of the corner and carefully pointed it in the direction he wanted to take. "Perfect," he said proudly. It's a perfect little, there being no Mogwai word for car that immediately came to mind, he merely shrugged and hopped inside. The vehicle was quite sporty, nearly 2 feet long, pink with red stripes, a battery-operated replica of a Corvette Stingray that seemed to be crying out to be test-driven. Flipping the switch to on, Gizmo was nearly jettisoned from the car by its sudden forward movement. He settled back and gained confidence during the long run down the aisleway, but found he couldn't turn the car as easily as he anticipated when it came to an intersection. The result was a collision with the display of oil cans, the pyramid collapsing a split second after being sideswiped by the Stingray. The heavy thunk of the cans hitting the floor behind him caused Gizmo to breathe a sigh of relief. He vowed to take future turns more deliberately. Whirring to the end of the aisle, he turned left and headed up the next one. A jumble of fallen hardware supplies slowed him down considerably, but he soon regained top speed again. As he passed through the next intersection, the sight of a figure moving down the aisle to his right caused Gizmo to swerve and brake so suddenly that the car piled into a neat line of garden tools. Ducking his head, he waited patiently until the rakes and hoes finished falling around him, and then raced back towards the spot where the mysterious form had been. The trap was so perfect, and yet so simple, that Stripe hardly felt the pain in his smashed foot. Because nothing complex was involved, his plan was nearly foolproof. The machine least likely to break down is the one with the fewest moving parts. So too with an ambush. The simpler, the better. The ambush Stripe now had in mind consisted of nothing more elaborate than a very long and narrow room with only one way in and out. There were no nooks and crannies to hide in, no cartons or boxes to use for cover, no closets to duck into. Called the Electronics Center, the room was simply a display area for several dozen television sets, home video games, and stereos, all neatly inset into the 3 walls. And the argot of the Old West, this was the box canyon into which Billy undoubtedly would come to meet his fate. At the very entrance to the room was a small closet, now occupied by Stripe. Clutched tightly to his chest were a bow and a batch of steel-tipped arrows he had found in the sporting goods department after smashing his foot. He had never used the weapon before, but knew the principle behind it, the bow and arrow being the standard primitive weapon of many galaxies, and therefore a residual, almost intuitive piece of knowledge. All that was required for his mastery of the weapon was a bit of practice, which would start as soon as his young enemy walked to the far end of the room. At that point, according to his plan, Stripe would step out of the closet and begin shooting. With nowhere to hide, Billy would eventually be hit by one or more of the arrows, and that would be that. And if the young man decided to look into the closet before going to the end of the room, so much the better, Stripe thought. Then he would receive an arrow at point-blank range. The only thing lost would be the fun of using him for practice, seeing him panic and plead before succumbing to a direct hit. Waiting patiently, it was not long before Stripe heard quiet footsteps moving down the aisle towards the room. Through the crack of the barely opened door, he saw the figure hesitate a moment, and then continue walking. In the semi-darkness of the store, he would be quite near the rear wall before realizing the room was a dead end, and by then, of course, it would be too late. Opening the door a bit wider, Stripe peered out and was pleased. "Just a few steps more," he whispered. Billy went farther than that, developing an interest in one of the pieces of equipment set into the far wall. Perfect, Stripe thought. Stepping quietly out of the closet, he knocked the first of his arrows and aimed it at an imaginary X between the young man's shoulder blades. Kate was so confused she was nearly crying. "How do you work this thing anyway?" she nearly shouted. For the past several minutes, she had been pushing various buttons on the control panel in front of her with a total lack of success. It was not, she thought angrily, a user-friendly system, not unlike the first word processor she had tried using. Instead of labeling the buttons plainly and simply, according to their functions, the operator apparently had to punch an access code followed by the digit or digits programmed for each activity within the department store. Luckily, Kate had found the access code, written on a piece of paper. But turning on the overhead lights was not so easy a matter. The closest she had come to it was when she punched the access code and the random digits 2-6, which turned on a string of permanently mounted Christmas lights near the main entrance. "Well, what the heck," she said now. "If 26 does something, I might as well try sequence dialing." With that, she punched the access code and followed with 2 and 7. Stripe pulled the bowstring as taut as he could make it, checked again to make sure his target was lined up correctly, and prepared to loose the first arrow. "Attention, please," a loud voice suddenly announced. Shocked nearly out of his wits, Stripe jerked his arm as the arrow flew from the bow, striking a television screen a foot above Billy's head. "Attention, please," the announcer continued. "The store will be closing in 10 minutes. Please complete any last-minute shopping you have so that our employees will be able to enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you." Startled by both the recorded announcement and the arrow crashing into the screen so close to him, Billy whirled. As he did so, he saw Stripe knock another arrow and aim it at him. Billy attempted to dance sideways, suddenly realizing that he was the main target in a shooting gallery. Stripe responded with a fierce giggle, followed him, and loosed a second arrow. It tore through Billy's jacket at the neckline. "That was close," Billy muttered. "He's a good shot." Already the gremlin's arm was ready with another arrow. Billy licked his lips, looked around for a possible way out, but saw nothing. His only immediate plan was to continue dodging until Stripe ran out of arrows. Either that or charge, which was not particularly smart in that it made him a bigger target. The third arrow headed his way, quicker and more accurate than the others. Falling prone, Billy heard it speed by his ear a second before he hit the deck. Stripe giggled again, reached down for yet another arrow. While scrambling to his feet, Billy followed the movement of the gremlin's hand and saw it grab an arrow from a pile that must have included at least 20 more. "There's no chance," Billy thought miserably. "With all those shots left, he'll get me for sure." But he could not bring himself to rush forward into the path of flying missiles. Kate hit the stop button just as the store closing announcement ended, and the ready button glowed expectantly. "Overhead lights," she said, as if trying to will the panel to obey her. "The heck with closing time, let me have the overhead lights." Punching buttons furiously, she continued the numerical sequence only because she didn't know what else to do. Numbers 27 through 46 were routine announcements similar to the store's closing, and number 47 through 69 dealt with the items currently on sale. Although she bailed out of each as soon as it failed to activate the lights, Kate was nearly beside herself. So much time was being wasted. Billy needed those lights, and she was powerless to find them. All because this complicated panel. As each number activated some insipid announcement, she pounded angrily on the desk, jabbed the stop button, and tried again. "Do it!" she ordered. "Just do it!" "Men's Fruit of the Loom underwear now on sale for the next 10... Pwing! A new parking lot will be open at Montgomery Ward on the... Whap! Golden spread satin paint now on sale... Thwong! Jeans for juveniles now... Thwack! In a way, the juxtaposition of the sound and sight was so bizarre it was almost funny. Here he was, his life on the line as the primary target in a shooting gallery, all to the bland accompaniment of retail sales pitches and announcements that were choked off in mid-sentence. except that Billy wasn't laughing. Those messages were him, a voice killed off by some unseen force just as it started to be heard. Quack! Behind him, and to his right, another television screen was blasted to glass powder by the gremlin's arrow. There was no doubt now about two vital things. Stripe was having a great deal of fun, and he was an expert with the bow. Billy knew instinctively that he was toying with him, puncturing TV screens nearby for the sheer joy of it as an intermediate bits of fun prior to sending a shaft into the back or his chest. So far, Stripe had used about half his pile of arrows. But the situation was made even worse for Billy when several shafts caromed all the way back to the shooter to be used again. Ski poles and jackets! Very deliberately, Stripe broke his pattern of 6 shots per minute and stood grinning at Billy. Still holding the bow poised for action, he first pointed at Billy with his free hand and then pointed to his own heart. Billy got the message. The fun and games were over, and now Stripe was about to shoot in earnest. Taking a deep breath, he stood, bouncing on the balls of his feet, readying himself to move as quickly as possible in any direction. But the experience of the past few minutes told him that he probably was not fast enough to avoid an arrow aimed directly at his heart. Stripe, meanwhile, was determined to end the game, having grown weary of it. Becoming used to the store's intermittent announcements, he was able to shut out the voice almost automatically. He prepared himself now, concentrating fully on lining up the target. Holy cow, look at that! You hit him low, Barney, and I'll give him a jolt of this! Stripe, barely cognizant of the background sound, and certainly not realizing its content, started to release the arrow. Quack! Plung! The erratically loosed arrow crashed into the ceiling and ricocheted into the floor as Peltzer, closing to within a few inches of the gremlin, unleashed a flume of shaving cream from the bathroom buddy. It shot like a white tornado directly into Stripe's eyes, causing him to shriek with pain. At the same time, Barney hurled himself at the creature's legs, snapping and growling. Realizing what had happened and that he now had an opportunity to escape, Billy rushed forward. His escape mission was instantaneously converted into a rescue dash, for Stripe recovered from the two-pronged attack with amazing speed, slapping Barney aside with the heavy bow as he shook the shaving cream from his face. The gremlin grabbed an arrow and in less than a second had it pointed at Rand's torso 10 feet away. Still too far away to be of any help to his father, Billy could only hurl himself through the air, which was split by 2 simultaneous cries. No! Yeah! Suddenly, Billy realized that the overhead lights of his aisleway were on, and that the cry of pain had come not from his father, but from Stripe. Still recoiling with shock, the gremlin dropped the bow and arrow and raced off towards an adjoining aisle, which was still dark. Barney started to follow, but stopped when Billy told him to stay. Sweating profusely, Rand shook his head and smiled, looking down at the bathroom buddy in his hand. Well, I guess this thing was good for something after all, he said. Thanks, Dad, Billy said. He started to go, but his father followed. Wait a minute. That thing's dangerous. Why don't you wait for the cops? No time. Pointing towards the office, Billy called back over his shoulder. Tell Kate to turn on all the lights. She's in the office. Then he was gone, racing into the darkness towards Stripe's retreating form. When the lights went on, Gizmo was in the process of making a left turn just outside the area from which all the noise was coming. Partially blinded and gripped by a spasm of pain, he lost control of the tiny car, which raced at nearly full speed into a rack of audio tapes. Curling into a ball beneath the dashboard, Gizmo debated whether or not he should come out into the bright light and result in pain. If he remained here, he would be all right until someone discovered him. But of course, that wouldn't help Billy. In this case, he thought, it's better to be sorry than safe. Thrusting his head back into the light, He winced, but saw through the pane that the light dropped off in the adjacent aisle. If he could just get there. Lucky, but dumb. That was the description Kate gave to her last act at the control panel, and now she was stuck with it. Totally frustrated at the array of trite announcements and failure to turn on the lights, she had abandoned her sequential digit plan and just punched furiously at the board. Miraculously, that desperate, almost spasmodic gesture resulted in a bank of lights going on, illuminating approximately 10% of the flooring area. That was good news. The bad news was that she had absolutely no idea what number she had punched. If adjacent overhead light systems were activated by numbers close to the one that she had punched, they were still as lost to her as before. "What was it?" she whispered, straining to recall where her fingers had gone. "What was that number?" It seemed as it had been something in the high 90s. Once again, feeding the computer the access code, she sighed and punched 98. "Ladies and gentlemen, we now direct your attention to the northernmost end of the store where the Carol B. Hebel Memorial Fountain is being turned on for the day. This magnificent piece of freeform sculpture, the work of Arnis Boudet, was constructed so that the interplay of falling water and lights would provide maximum dynamic effect. Although relatively new, the fountain is already known throughout the state as an outstanding example of art and business working together to increase your shopping pleasure." The significance of the announcement did not register with Billy until he heard the gentle bubbling noise in the distance. Then, playing it back in his mind, he heard the all-important words, "Fountain. Water." "No!" he yelled at the top of his lungs, breaking stride only to scream it again as he ran a few steps backward. "No! Turn it off! Turn it off! Turn off the fountain!" He realized Kate was too far away to hear him, but perhaps if his father, several hundred feet behind him, heard his plea, he would relay the message. In the meantime, Stripe continued to run ahead of him, racing as fast as he could. Billy was gaining on him, but a tiny voice in his head told him that the damage had already been done. The fountain was running. There was no withdrawing the water that had fallen, and its telltale murmur was a siren song for the creature ahead who was rapidly approaching it. Barney, well in front of Billy, was following Stripe closely, snapping at his tail and hind legs. But that was only harassment, and what they needed now was containment. If Barney had been trained as a watch or attack dog, he might have been able to restrain the gremlin. Now the most he could do was irritate and distract him while protecting himself from Stripe's slashing claws. The northern end of the store was outfitted as a sort of greenhouse, filled with flowers of all kinds along the walls, which supported a magnificent skylight, now covered by a large canvas tarpaulin. In the darkness, the flowers blended together, forming an overhanging canopy, so that moving through the entrance was rather like entering a tropical rainforest. Stripe abruptly turned at the door and gave Barney a swipe with his claws that sent the dog scurrying backwards several feet. He remained at that distance, barking ferociously. Having taken care of his canine pursuer, Stripe looked directly at Billy, giggled triumphantly, and pointed to the glistening wall of water sheeting downward from the lip of the top fountain. Billy's chest seemed about to burst from exertion, but he forced himself to continue running. Faster, faster. Then all of a sudden it was too late. When Billy closed to within 20 feet of him, Stripe, taking no chances, leaped onto the ledge of the fountain, teetered there one tantalizing moment, and then did a gentle backflip into the water. The sight turned Billy's legs to strands of limp spaghetti. Leaning against the entrance wall, he allowed himself to slide slowly to the floor. Closing his eyes, he tried not to think of the past 24 hours, but the gremlin's giggling, mixed with the sound of falling water, made it impossible to forget. 4 times he thought he had solved the problem. At home, in the YMCA, the theater, and now here, successful each time, except for Stripe. He took a deep breath and let the air out very slowly. Already he could hear the faint popping sounds as the bubbles that would become new gremlins began to erupt from the surface of Stripe's skin. Gizmo, still at the wheel of the miniature stingray, rolled through the entrance to the greenhouse and immediately saw the worst. Billy sitting distraught, Stripe laughing despite the pain of reproduction, and nothing could be done to set matters straight. Unless... His gaze moving quickly from floor to ceiling, Gizmo chirped optimistically, whipped the car sharply to the right, and applied full power. One thing Mog Turman had done correctly was give his creation a mind that was capable of rapidly analyzing a situation and coming up with a solution. That's why the tarpaulin, latch, and string were just objects in a big room to Billy the human, but answers to Gizmo the Mogwai. As soon as he spotted them, he knew there was still a chance to pull this one out. Nearly crashing into the rear wall, he leaped from the car and raced for the spot where the rope was wound around the steel latch. It was just out of reach. Babbling in Mogwai, he pushed the stingray beneath the spot and leaped onto the hood. Working as quickly as he could with his clumsy paws, he slowly twisted the rope free of the metal latch. The final turn released it with such force Gizmo felt his feet lifted from the car and his body being carried upward at a breathtaking rate of speed. Closing his eyes, he let go his grip, tumbling downward onto the hood of the car and then to the floor. Above him he saw the canvas tarpaulin begin to roll away from the windows, the long narrow strips sliding neatly into compartments hidden beneath the sills. As they did so, a flood of bright, early morning sunlight cut a bluish-white path through the middle third of the entire greenhouse. Squarely in that path was Stripe. Magnified and focused by the window glass, the sunlight fell across the prostrate gremlin like a superheated girder, a searing weight he was powerless to move. Nor could he move his own body, weakened as it was by the light and the effort of reproducing new gremlins. Soon hot fluids began to ooze from his pores, eyes, and the sides of his mouth. He tried to scream, but all that emerged was a guttural moan. Trapped in their brief moment of vulnerability before birth, the bubbles forming on Stripe's skin smoldered, blistered, and cracked. The grisly product of both the cool water and the hot violence of the gremlin's death rose in a gray mist from the fountain and gradually dispersed, the final creation of the worst night in Kingston Falls history. Chapter 20. By the day after Christmas, reasonably normal patterns of living had returned to the Peltzer household in most of Kingston Falls. Newspeople from all over the state continued to pick through the wreckage, not only of buildings but of people's minds, and their efforts to dig out the grisliest details of the event. But the townspeople as a whole seemed anxious only to forget what had happened and resume their ordinary lives. Billy managed to avoid the news hounds. He did so not because he shunned publicity or notoriety, but because he knew that any exhaustive series of questions would lead to Gizmo's part in the mess. Billy wanted to avoid that at all costs. He thought it would be difficult, if not impossible, because so many people knew he was involved. But preserving his anonymity was surprisingly easy. The person who knew most about Billy's involvement, Pete Fontaine, was so terrified when he heard that Roy Hansen had been killed by an unknown creature in his lab that he ran away from home, thinking the police would connect him with the murder. Kate, of course, respected Billy's desire to be left out of it, as did his parents. Sheriff Riley and Deputy Brent conveniently forgot that they had ignored a warning from Billy, but did accept an award for the meritorious service by the National Association of Chiefs of Police. General David Greene appeared several times on local and national television, describing how he had relentlessly pursued the gremlins until the last one was destroyed. In any event, there being glory enough for everyone and little impetus to assign blame, Billy managed to stay out of it. As the furor began to die down, he started to believe there would be no more fallout from the gremlin invasion. He was correct, until the night after Christmas. Kate, Billy, and his parents had just finished dinner when the doorbell rang. Billy opened the door, revealing an elderly Oriental man. His expression was angry but controlled, like a parent who must punish a child. The wind blew through his straggly white hair, accentuating his doomsday look. Although Billy had never seen the man, he sensed immediately who he was and why he had come. "Yes?" he asked timorously.
"I have come for Mogwai,"
the old Chinese man said. He looked past Billy, catching sight of Rand. Billy indicated that he should enter, and the old gentleman stepped into the room. At the sound of the old man's voice, Gizmo, seated on the sofa nursing his sore back, immediately perked up his ears and lunged forward. Chirping excitedly, he nearly fell off the sofa in his efforts to reach the Chinese man, covering the distance in 4 big leaps. Lifting the creature and nuzzling it gently, the old gentleman smiled slightly.
"I've missed you, my friend,"
he said. Looking at them together, Billy was both touched and saddened. He could see that they had not only love as a bond, but many years of understanding and comfort. Rand, feeling he should at least state his rights, if not assert them, walked towards the Chinese man. "Now just a minute," he said softly. "I paid good money for him, and my boy's quite attached to him."
"I did not accept the money," the Chinese man said. "My grandson did that, and he has been sentenced to his room for a month as a result."
He reached into his coat and pulled out a roll of bills.
"Here is your money," he said. "I did not deduct the expenses in order to find you and get here, because you lost possible interest the money would have earned if you had kept it. We've both lost and are even. Here, take it, please."
Rand, his gaze alternating between the Chinese man and Billy, ignored the gesture. "It's not that easy," he said.
"Never mind, Dad," Billy murmured. "It's all right." "I warned you," the Chinese man said to Rand. "Mogwai needs more responsibility, but you did not listen."
Rand shrugged. "Well, we know now. We'll be more responsible in the future."
"That is experience, not responsibility," the Chinese man corrected. "Responsibility is doing the wise thing before taking punishment, not after."
"Yeah," Rand muttered. "Well."
"Chinese philosopher once wrote, 'Society without responsibility is society without hope,'" the Chinese man added. Then he looked at Billy. "I am sorry," he said. "I'll miss him, too," Billy smiled grimly. "But maybe this is best. I can visit, I hope." The old Chinese gentleman nodded. Gizmo, nestled comfortably in the old man's arms, looked at Billy and felt a terrible surge of sadness. If only he could say the human words that would let his friend know how he felt. If only Mog Turman had... A pox on Mog Turman, he thought angrily. I can communicate. I must. And I will. I will project human words and not be embarrassed if they come out as gibberish. At least then I'll know I tried my best. Closing his eyes, he concentrated deeply and powerfully for a long moment. Then his tiny mouth opened,
and human words came forth, tinged with a Mogwai accent, but nevertheless completely understandable.
Bye, Billy.
Gizmo said. Billy and his parents burst into laughter and tears at the same time. Even Kate was visibly affected, though she had known Gizmo only briefly. "He talked!" Billy shouted, reaching out to kiss Gizmo on the top of his head.
You have accomplished a great deal, the Chinese man said. We will always remember you.
Billy nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat.
Good evening,
the Chinese man said. As they went through the doorway into the cold night, Gizmo raised his paw in a little wave. Billy waved back, then shut the door quickly. He did not want to watch as they moved slowly into the darkness and out of his life. And that is the end of the novelization of Gremlins by George Gipe. Thank you so much for spending this time with me as we've read through it. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And come back soon for the next book. But in the meantime, keep reading.